Power did not abandon Alessandro DeLuca that night. It followed him home. The gates closed behind the convoy with the same mechanical certainty they always had. Steel met steel. Locks slid into place. Guards returned to their posts without instruction. The estate settled into its familiar silence. Controlled, obedient, absolute. And yet the silence no longer obeyed him. Alessandro stood in the center of the marble foyer longer than necessary. His coat still on. His hands empty at his sides. The image refused to leave his mind. A woman's back straight and unyielding, and a small hand disappearing into hers as if it had always belonged there. He had watched enemies die without flinching. He had ended wars with a word. But watching Emilia Rossi walk away without looking back had hollowed something out of him. He moved through the house with measured steps, past rooms designed to impress men who feared him. Everything here had been chosen for permanence. Stone, glass, weight. Nothing had been chosen for warmth. Nothing had been chosen for children. That absence pressed in now. In his study, Alessandro poured a drink and let it sit untouched. The city glowed beyond the window, a map of power he had memorized long ago. Treats, territories, leverage. Somewhere inside that grid, Emilia was putting her child to bed. The thought arrived uninvited and stayed. He replayed the moment at the crosswalk with the precision he once reserved for strategy. Not the shock, not the recognition, the instinct. The way she had shifted without thinking, placing herself between the child and the world. No fear, no hesitation, just certainty. That kind of certainty was built over years. And it had been built without him. Alessandro closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Regret was useless. Sentiment was dangerous. What mattered now was clarity. He did not believe in coincidence. If fate had chosen a crosswalk to resurrect the past, it was because the past had unfinished business. He reached for the phone. "Marco," he said when the line connected. His voice was steady. "I want information." There was no surprise on the other end. "On her." "Yes." Was. Controlled. Respectful. "And the child?" Alessandro's jaw tightened. Just enough to register. "Everything." The call ended without ceremony. Emilia Rossi did not slow down until the apartment door closed behind her. Only then did she lean her forehead briefly against the wood, her breath uneven, her heart pounding hard enough to hurt. She waited, counted to 5, then 10, until her hands stopped shaking. Matteo tugged gently at her sleeve. "Mom." She straightened immediately. "I'm okay," she said too quickly, then softened it. "I just need a second." He studied her with the same quiet seriousness he carried everywhere. Children learned early when answers were incomplete. Matteo had learned earlier than most. "The man from the car," he said. "You knew him." Emilia knelt, bringing herself to his level. She chose her words carefully, the way she always did when the truth was sharp. "I knew who he used to be." "Is he bad?" She considered that. Really considered it. "He made choices," she said finally. "And those choices mattered." Matteo nodded as if that explained everything. Perhaps it did. She stood, locked the door, and moved through the apartment on instinct. Lights, kettle, routine. Survival was structure. Structure kept fear from spreading. But later, when Matteo slept and the city pressed close through the thin walls, Emilia sat at the edge of the bed and stared at the dark. Of all the streets, of all the nights, she had built her life on the assumption that Alessandro DeLuca was gone forever. That assumption had been her foundation. Foundations she knew could crack. The file arrived before dawn. Alessandro read it in silence, page by page. His expression unreadable. Dresses. Work schedules. Financial strain documented with ruthless precision. A life balanced on discipline and sacrifice. Then the final page. Name, Matteo Rossi. Age 6. Alessandro's fingers stilled. The math did not need doing. It had already been done the moment he saw the child's eyes in the crosswalk. Too steady, too familiar. Blood recognized blood. A photograph slipped loose from the folder and landed on the desk. Emilia outside a daycare. The boy mid-sentence. His posture unconsciously mirroring Alessandro's own. The room felt smaller. Alessandro DeLuca had spent his life eliminating vulnerabilities before they could be used against him. This one had existed for 6 years. Unprotected. Unacknowledged. Alive. He stood slowly, the weight of the truth settling into something heavier than fear. "I walked away once," he said to the empty room. He would not do it again. But stepping closer did not mean stepping carelessly. Outside, the city woke. Somewhere within it, a woman who had learned to survive without him prepared her child for another day. And somewhere else, men were already watching. Power, Alessandro understood now, was no longer about distance. It was about what you chose to stand between, and what you were finally willing to risk being seen for protecting. The gates closed behind him with the same precision they always had. Steel meeting steel, locks sliding into place as if sealing the world exactly where it belonged. Guards nodded. Engines went quiet. The estate settled into its nightly stillness. Alessandro DeLuca stepped inside and felt none of the relief that usually followed his return. The house was vast and immaculate, every surface polished, every corridor lit just enough to suggest vigilance without warmth. His footsteps echoed briefly, then vanished, swallowed by space. This place had been designed to impress men who feared him, not to answer questions he had spent years refusing to ask. He removed his coat and draped it over a chair without looking. The gesture felt automatic, practiced. Everything here did. Control had shaped this house the way it had shaped his life. Clean lines, no excess, nothing that could be taken from him. And yet the silence pressed differently now. He walked through the room slowly, noticing details he had ignored for years. The absence of sound. The absence of clutter. The absence of anything that suggested someone stayed because they wanted to, not because they were ordered to. No laughter caught in the walls. No small shoes abandoned near a doorway. No proof that life lingered when the lights went down. In his study, Alessandro poured a drink and set the glass on the desk. The amber liquid caught the light, steady and unmoving. He watched it longer than necessary, then turned away without touching it. Beyond the window, the city stretched out in orderly grids of light. Streets he owned, corners he controlled. A system that obeyed him with unwavering consistency. He had always found comfort in that view. Tonight, it felt distant, like a map of a place he no longer fully inhabited. Uninvited, the moment returned. The red light. The stillness. A woman's back moving away from him without hesitation. He saw it again with brutal clarity. The way she had shifted her body, instinctive and sure, placing herself between the child and the world. No calculation. No fear. Just certainty. The kind built slowly, through years of choosing someone else over yourself. Alessandro rested his hands on the edge of the desk. His reflection faint in the glass. For the first time the question surfaced without disguise. Not who was the child, but what had he left behind. He had told himself silence was discipline. That distance was protection. That walking away had been an act of control. The truth, waiting patiently all these years, felt heavier now. Silence had not been neutral. It had been a decision. Alessandro straightened, drawing a steady breath. Whatever had shifted inside him did not feel temporary. Did not feel like doubt. Felt like a line crossed without permission. The city continued to glow beneath his window, indifferent and alive. Somewhere within it, a woman he once loved was closing a door behind her, choosing safety over memory. And Alessandro DeLuca, who had built an empire on restraint, understood with quiet certainty that doing nothing was no longer an option. Morning came before Emilia was ready for it. She rose quietly, moving through the small apartment with practiced care, stepping around loose floorboards and the chair that never quite sat straight. The city outside was still half asleep, gray light pressing through the thin curtains as if testing whether she was prepared to be seen. She brewed coffee she wouldn't finish and packed lunch she might not eat. Routine came first. Everything else waited. Matteo stirred from the bedroom, rubbing his eyes as he shuffled into the kitchen. His hair stuck up in soft defiance, his expression already thoughtful, as if he'd been awake longer than his body admitted. Emilia knelt to straighten his jacket, smoothing the fabric with gentle, efficient hands. "You sleep okay?" she asked. He nodded, then paused. "You were quiet last night." She smiled lightly. "That's a good thing." He studied her face, the way he always did when answers felt incomplete, then accepted it without argument. Matteo had learned early which questions could wait. They left the apartment together, locking the door behind them. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old paint. Outside, the morning had found its rhythm. Buses sighing at stops, people moving with purpose, eyes already fixed on the day ahead. Emilia took Matteo's hand, her grip firm but familiar, and walked. At the daycare, she crouched in front of him, adjusting his backpack straps. "I'll be back," she said, meeting his eyes. "Same time. Promise?" he asked. "Always." He nodded, reassured, and disappeared inside without looking back. Emilia waited until the door closed before straightening, exhaling slowly as if she'd been holding her breath since the night before. Work followed work. The cafe in the morning, where smiles were currency and fatigue was invisible. The cleaning job later, where no one noticed her unless something was missed. Emilia moved through it all without complaint, her body remembering what her mind tried to forget. Survival left little room for reflection. And yet, as the day stretched on, fragments threatened to surface. Black car at a red light. A familiar posture behind tinted glass. A past she had buried with careful, deliberate effort. Emilia pushed the images aside each time they appeared. Thinking about Alessandro DeLuca did nothing but invite questions she had already answered years ago. He had chosen his world. She had chosen this one. Endurance over power. Presence over protection that came with conditions. By late afternoon, fatigue settled deep into her bones. She finished her shift, washed her hands, and stepped back onto the street. The city felt louder now, closer. As she walked, she became aware of something she couldn't name. A faint tightening at the back of her neck, the sensation of being observed. She slowed, glanced at her reflection in a storefront window. Nothing out of place. Just her. Just the street. Emilia shook it off and kept walking. By the time she reached the daycare, Matteo was already waiting, swinging his legs from a chair, face bright when he saw her. He ran to her without hesitation, and she caught him easily, grounding herself in the solid weight of him. Whatever shadows lingered at the edges of her day, Emilia refused to give them shape. She took Matteo's hand and walked home, choosing motion over memory, unaware that somewhere nearby, someone else had begun to watch, and that the life she had built so carefully was no longer entirely unseen. Alessandro did not sleep. The night passed in fragments, brief moments of stillness interrupted by the same image returning uninvited. He stopped trying to push it away and let the hours run their course. By dawn, the decision had already settled into place, quiet and unavoidable. Marco arrived without being summoned twice. He always did. He stood just inside the study, hands loosely folded, posture relaxed in a way that came only from years of shared discipline. He had seen Alessandro calm in chaos, ruthless in victory, restrained in moments when others would have panicked. This silence, however, was different. "I want information," Alessandro said at last. His gaze fixed on the city beyond the window. Marco did not ask who. "Discreet," Alessandro continued. "No contact. No disruption. I want patterns, not reactions." Marco nodded once. "Scope." Alessandro's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Address. Work. Routine." Pause followed. Measured. Respectful. "And the child?" Marco asked. Alessandro turned then, slowly. His expression remained controlled, but something sharper had entered his eyes. "Everything," he said. But quietly. Marco accepted the answer without comment. He had learned long ago that the questions Alessandro refused to name were the ones that mattered most. "This is precaution," he said, not as a question. "Yes," Alessandro replied. The word came too quickly. "Nothing more." Marco inclined his head. "I'll handle it." As he turned to leave, Alessandro added, "No one else needs to know." "No one will," Marco said, and meant it. When the door closed, the room felt larger than before. Alessandro returned to the desk, resting his hands against the polished surface. He told himself this was control, that knowing was safer than guessing, that observation kept everyone protected. He did not tell himself why his chest felt tight. For years, enemies had circled him openly, tested his borders, challenged his authority. He had never hesitated then. Violence was simple. Loyalty was transactional. Power responded predictably to pressure. This was different. This was not a threat he could eliminate. Not a rival he could outmaneuver. The danger lived in what the answers might demand of him once they arrived. Responsibility had weight. Knowledge carried obligation. Alessandro had built his life on the careful management of both. He moved through the house as the morning advanced, noting details he had ignored the day before, the way light fell across empty furniture, the echo of his own footsteps. He stopped in the hallway outside a room that had never been used for anything at all and stood there longer than necessary, uncertain why. Fear entered quietly without spectacle. Not fear of loss of power. Not fear of exposure. Fear of certainty. By mid-morning the city was fully awake. Somewhere within it, a woman was moving through her day, unaware that the distance she had relied on for years was beginning to close. Alessandro stood at the window once more, watching traffic flow beneath him, each car a possibility, each street a thread leading toward an answer he had not yet spoken aloud. He told himself again that this was precaution, that observation was not action, that silence could still be controlled. But even as he reached for his phone to confirm the request, Alessandro knew the truth he had avoided all night. Once the files arrived, silence would no longer protect him. It would only delay what came next. The file arrived just after dawn. It was placed on Alessandro's desk without ceremony, a slim folder aligned perfectly with the edge as if precision could soften what waited inside. Marco did not speak when he delivered it. He didn't need to. Some information announced itself by its weight alone. Alessandro stood for a long moment before opening it, hands resting flat against the polished surface. Outside, the city was waking, traffic building, lights switching off one by one. Life moving forward, indifferent to what was about to be named. He opened the folder. Pages turned quietly beneath his fingers. Addresses, employment records, gaps that told their own story. Numbers that spoke of restraint, of a life balanced carefully between necessity and exhaustion. He read without expression, absorbing details with the same discipline he applied to contracts and maps. Then he reached the page marked dependent. Matteo Rossi, 6. Alessandro's hand stilled. He read the birth date once. Then again. The calculation formed instantly, cold and exact. Memory supplied what the paper did not. The last night he saw Emilia, the words he had used like a blade, the door closing between them. The timing aligned with ruthless precision. He turned the page. Medical summaries followed. Routine visits. No father listed. Emergency contact. Emilia Rossi. Only her. Always her. A note from a clinic appointment caught his attention, understated but unmistakable, strong resemblance to paternal line. Alessandro exhaled slowly through his nose. Resemblance. He thought of the crosswalk. The child's eyes, dark and steady. The posture that mirrored his own without effort, without awareness. He had dismissed it as coincidence then. He did not make that mistake now. A photograph slipped free from the folder and landed face up on the desk. It was recent, taken from a distance. Emilia stood outside a daycare entrance, her hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. Matteo was mid-sentence, brow faintly furrowed in concentration. The tilt of his head. The line of his jaw. Even the way he stood, feet planted, ready. Blood did not forget. Alessandro closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. There was no surge of emotion, no dramatic fracture. Just a steady, crushing certainty settling into place. He had a son. The realization arrived without triumph or relief. It came as consequence, unavoidable and absolute. 6 years of absence condensed into a single truth he could not undo. He rose and moved to the window, the file still open on the desk behind him. Somewhere in the city, Matteo was waking up, eating breakfast, preparing for a day that had never included Alessandro DeLuca. A life built without his protection, without his name. He turned back, resolve forming with familiar clarity. "Marco," he said quietly. Marco appeared at the doorway at once. "Double the protection," Alessandro said. "No visibility. No mistakes." Marco nodded. "And contact?" Alessandro's jaw tightened. "None. Not yet." As Marco left, Alessandro looked once more at the photograph on his desk. He did not touch it. He had walked away once. This time, blood would not allow silence to stand in his place. The city shifted without announcing it. Alessandro's orders moved through familiar channels, quietly, efficiently, without names attached. Men adjusted positions as if responding to weather rather than command. A car remained parked a little longer than usual. A figure appeared at a corner cafe every morning, nursing the same cup long after it went cold. Routes were noted, patterns traced, timings memorized. Nothing touched Emilia Rossi's life directly. That was the rule. From his study, Alessandro watched reports assemble themselves into clean lines and precise timestamps. He studied movement, not faces. Intersections, not conversations. He had learned long ago that proximity created attachment, and attachment distorted judgment. This required discipline of a different kind. 2 layers formed around her without her knowing. The first was visible only to him. Men who blended into crowds, cars that followed at a respectful distance, eyes trained to see disruption before it announced itself. The second was invisible even to those watching the first. Redundancies built to notice patterns others missed. Alessandro trusted the second more. He told himself this was procedure. At midday, a photo appeared on his screen. Matteo on a playground, laughing as he ran, arms pumping with earnest determination. Another followed. Emilia seated on a bench nearby, posture alert but relaxed, her gaze never straying far. Alessandro studied the image longer than he intended. The boy laughed again in the next frame, mouth open, head tipped back without fear. Alessandro felt something tighten, not with joy but with urgency. He closed the image and returned to the report. Threat assessment low. Environmental risk manageable. External interest none detected. Now. He moved through his afternoon as he always had. Meetings, decisions, quiet authority. But every update pulled him back to streets he did not walk, to moments he was not part of. Protection without presence required patience. It also required restraint he was still learning to practice. Emilia felt none of it. Her day unfolded as it always did. Work, errands, the familiar choreography of time stretched thin. Matteo talked about school, about a game he had invented, about nothing that mattered and everything that did. She listened, smiled, corrected him gently when he skipped steps crossing the street. The world pressed close, but not dangerously so. That night, Alessandro stood at the window again, city lights blurring beneath his gaze. He reviewed the final report before setting the phone aside. All quiet. All contained. This was not ownership. This was obligation. He understood that now. But understanding did not equal permanence. The longer he watched from a distance, the more fragile the balance felt. Protection without permission invited questions. Questions from rivals, from fate, from himself. Silence could not hold forever. Neither could shadows. Alessandro DeLuca, who had mastered patience as a weapon, recognized the truth settling uncomfortably into place. This arrangement would fail. Not because it was careless, but because eventually, restraint demanded a different kind of courage, one that could not remain unseen. The first sign arrived quietly, tucked into a routine report that should have meant nothing. A name appeared where it didn't belong. Familiar, careless. A crew that knew better than to wander without reason. Alessandro noticed it immediately. He always did. Patterns were his language, and this one carried a faint distortion, barely visible unless you were already looking for it. He read the report again, slower. Increased presence on the south side. No disputes. No negotiations. Just men watching streets that offered no advantage. Cars idling too long. Conversations that ended when others drew near. Interest without purpose. Alessandro closed the file and leaned back in his chair. For years, his enemies had complained he was impossible to read. No vices, no attachments, no fractures to exploit. That reputation had kept him insulated from precisely this kind of attention. Something had changed. Marco confirmed it before Alessandro asked. They've noticed movement, he said. Not the source. Just the ripple. How patient are they? Alessandro asked. Marco considered. Patient enough to wait for confirmation. That was worse. Confirmation meant observation. Observation invited exposure. Alessandro had not misstepped, but restraint had altered his rhythm, and rivals sensed deviation the way predators sensed injury. A message arrived that evening through a channel reserved for civility masquerading as concern. A dinner invitation. Neutral territory. Polite language. Old names signed beneath the words. Alessandro declined without response. The next message abandoned courtesy altogether. Everyone has something to lose. He read it once, then set the phone down. The words were not a threat. They were a reminder, delivered by men who believed they had finally found the edge of his armor. They were wrong. But not entirely. Alessandro adjusted quietly. Route shifted. Coverage widened, not closer. Protection remained invisible, untouched by panic. Escalation would confirm suspicion. Withdrawal would invite pursuit. He chose stillness instead, a calculated refusal to react. From the outside it looked like nothing. From the inside the margins were tightening. Emilia felt the city watching more closely now, though she could not have explained why. The feeling came and went, subtle enough to dismiss. She kept moving, kept Matteo close, trusted the habits that had carried her this far. Alessandro watched through summaries and timestamps, forcing himself not to linger on images that tempted him into proximity. This was not the time for presence. This was the time for discipline. Still, the truth pressed harder with every whisper. In his world, love was leverage. Even the rumor of it carried weight. He had spent years convincing everyone, himself included, that he possessed nothing that could be used against him. The lie was unraveling. Late that night, Alessandro stood alone in his study, city lights fractured by rain against the glass. He understood the mistake his rivals were making. They believed exposure would make him reckless. They did not yet understand what restraint could do. But as he stared out at streets that now held more than territory, Alessandro accepted the cost that came with being seen. Silence was no longer enough. And the message lingered, sharp and undeniable. Everyone had something to lose. The difference was that Alessandro DeLuca now knew exactly what his was, and what he would do to protect it. Alessandro went alone. The morning was pale and undecided, the city not yet committed to the day. He parked several blocks away and walked the rest, coat collar turned up, hands empty. No convoy. No shadows trailing him. Visibility, chosen carefully, felt heavier than any weapon he owned. Emilia was locking the apartment door when he saw her. She moved with the same efficiency he remembered. Keys ready, bag balanced, attention already forward. Matteo stood close at her side, backpack too large for his shoulders, face alert in the way children learned to be when the world asked too much too soon. Alessandro stopped before they noticed him. For a moment he only watched. Not as a man who commanded outcomes, but as one witnessing a life that had continued without permission. Matteo said something that made Emilia smile, and the sound landed in Alessandro's chest like a quiet blow. He stepped forward. "Emilia!" She froze. Slowly she turned. Recognition passed over her face without surprise, then settled into something guarded and controlled. Her hand found Matteo's shoulder immediately, firm and protective. "Alessandro," she said. Her voice held no welcome, no fear either. Matteo looked between them, curious. "Who's that?" Emilia didn't hesitate. "Someone from my past." Alessandro lowered himself slightly, not crouching, not looming, just enough to meet the child's eye line without claiming space. Matteo studied him openly. "You're early," Matteo said, serious. Alessandro almost smiled. "So I am." Emilia's gaze never left Alessandro. "Why are you here?" He stood, hands visible, voice even. "Because pretending I didn't see you isn't an option anymore. That doesn't give you a place in my life," she said immediately. "I know," he replied. There was no argument in him. No authority. "I'm not here to take anything." Silence stretched. The street remained empty, the city holding its breath. Emilia's eyes searched his face, not for affection but for risk. "Whatever this is," she said, "it does not involve my child." "It already does," Alessandro answered softly, then corrected himself. "But only on my side. Not yours." Matteo shifted, sensing the weight of words he didn't understand. "Mom," he said quietly, "are we late?" "No," she replied without looking away. "We're not late." She turned back to Alessandro. "You should leave." "I will," he said. "After this." He met her eyes, steady and unarmed. "I won't disappear again." The words settled between them, simple, dangerous, irreversible. Emilia said nothing. She guided Matteo past him, her shoulder brushing the morning air, her choice unmistakable. Alessandro remained where he was long after they were gone, the city waking around him. He had crossed a line he could not retreat from. And this time, absence was no longer a refuge he could claim. The meeting began without ceremony. Alessandro stood at the head of the table, hands resting lightly on the polished surface, eyes moving once around the room. These were men who understood power in its rawest form. Territory gained, threats eliminated, expansion measured in fear. They were accustomed to momentum, to growth that left little room for hesitation. "We're pulling back," Alessandro said. The words landed heavily. He spoke next of routes that would be closed, of operations folded quietly into others, of visibility reduced by design. Exposure, he explained, had become unnecessary risk. Influence did not require constant demonstration. Safety required discipline. One man leaned forward, brow furrowed. "We'll lose ground. We'll lose noise," Alessandro replied. "Ground remains." Another spoke more carefully. "Rivals will read this as uncertainty." Alessandro did not answer at once. He reached for a folder instead and opened it, sliding documents across the table. Directives already prepared. Structures already adjusted. Authority redistributed with deliberate restraint. "This is not uncertainty," he said finally. "This is endurance." He signed where ink was required. His name steady, unadorned. The motions were precise, final. He was not weakening the empire. He was removing its dependence on spectacle, and on himself alone. No one argued. They had learned, over years of survival, that when Alessandro made decisions this quietly, they were not invitations. The meeting ended as it had begun, without raised voices, without resolution offered to those who wanted explanations. Alessandro did not provide them. He did not owe them. Outside the room, word spread quickly. Routes changed. Movements slowed. Patterns shifted in ways rivals could see but not interpret. From a distance it looked like retreat. They smiled. Across the city, men who watched for cracks convinced themselves they had found one. They spoke in low tones of hesitation, of a king stepping back from his own shadow. They mistook restraint for fear, silence for doubt. Alessandro stood alone later that night, looking out at the city from his study. It no longer appeared as a map to be conquered. It appeared as distance, space that required management, not domination. Power, he understood now, was not measured by how much it consumed. It was measured by what it chose not to touch. And as rivals leaned closer, certain they were witnessing weakness, Alessandro DeLuca allowed the illusion to stand, knowing that patience had always been his most dangerous weapon. Night settled unevenly over the city. From his window, Alessandro watched the lights as if seeing them for the first time, not as markers of territory, but as distances between lives. Streets no longer aligned into clean lines of control. They branched, overlapped, disappeared into neighborhoods he had never needed to know. Somewhere within that sprawl, a small apartment held a woman and a child who slept without his name, without his protection, and now, without his absence. The glass reflected his face faintly. Older than he remembered. Quieter. He had spent years believing power meant never narrowing your world. Expansion had been survival. Distance had been safety. Now everything meaningful existed inside a tighter frame, and there was no way to widen it without breaking something. Alessandro rested his palm against the window, not touching the glass, just close enough to feel the cold. He understood the cost now. Every choice he made from this point forward would carry weight beyond strategy. Every restraint would be noticed. Every silence interpreted. Coming back did not restore what he had lost. It redefined what he could no longer afford to lose. Across the city, Emilia moved through her evening with practiced calm. The apartment hummed softly, water running, a kettle cooling on the stove, the quiet sounds of a day ending. Matteo padded down the hallway in socks too thin for the season, clutching a book he pretended to read. She tucked him in carefully, smoothing the blanket, brushing hair from his forehead. The world felt closer at night, the walls thinner, the quiet more intimate. She lingered longer than usual, memorizing the shape of his face as if time might suddenly demand it. "Mom," he murmured, eyes already closed. "You're here." "Always," she said. The words settled into the room with the weight of a promise she intended to keep. When she turned off the light and closed the door, Emilia leaned briefly against the frame. She felt steadier than she had days ago, but not untouched. Something had shifted, subtle, persistent. A sense that the future she had built so carefully had tightened around a new truth she had not invited but could not ignore. She did not know what was coming, only that it would not pass quietly. Alessandro lowered his hand and stepped back from the window. The city continued to glow, indifferent and alive. Somewhere a child slept safely. Somewhere else, men mistook restraint for weakness and patience for surrender. They would learn. For now the night held. Two lives, altered without agreement, moved forward along paths that no longer ran parallel but had not yet crossed again. The story did not end there. Tightened.